House of Representatives has passed the Violent Radicalization and Homegrown Terrorism Prevention Act by a 404-6 vote.
HR1955, as I understand it, provides a basis for subjective interpretation of dissident speech that allows those in power to criminally penalize anything they consider to be particularly effective in terms of galvanizing an opposition that might conceivably, in some sense, disrupt or destabilize the status quo.
When I looked up the word force in the online dictionary, there were a few definitions that put the word in perspective in relation to the definition of homegrown terrorism as given in HR 1955, the Violent Radicalization and Homegrown Terrorism Prevention Act of 2007. To put it plainly, the definitions of force in this context were frightening. Section 899A3 of the bill defines homegrown terrorism as a term meaning the use, planned use, or threatened use of force or violence by a group or individual born, raised, or based within the United States to intimidate or coerce the United States government, its population, or any segment thereof in furtherance of political or social objectives. The very first thing I noticed when I read this passage of the bill was that the words force and violence were separated by or, meaning that their definition of force meant something other than violence. I was curious. If force didn't mean violence, then what did it mean? I'm very concerned about what I came up with. The first and second definitions didn't make any sense in regards to the bill, being that both definitions implied violence, and the bill clearly meant force to be something other than violence. The third and fourth definitions, however, gave me goosepimples. The third definition defined force as A, intellectual power or vigor, especially as conveyed in writing or speech, and C, a capacity for affecting the mind or behavior, as in the force of logical argument. Imagine defining homegrown terrorism as the use, planned use, or threatened use of intellectual power or vigor, or defining it as the use, planned use, or threatened use of a logical argument. Neither of those sound right. They'd both be ridiculous interpretations of the word force in this context. I don't like to think that that's what the authors of this bill mean, but I have seen a great deal of this kind of thinking being broadcast on mainstream networks, almost as though we were being softened up for this kind of thinking. I'll give you an example.
It was omitted. Building 7 9/11 report omitted. The entire thing, never in the history of the world has a building fallen from a fire into its own footprint, eliminating the core, 25 steel beams. Really impossible, physics-wise, impossible.
Well, what do you think is really happening with the ship that was in there? You think that these British soldiers were used as pawns to try to ignite another war against Iran?
Historically, have governments ever faked incidents or incited incidents in order to get them into wars? Nations.
Do you think this has
happened historically?
I'm sure it has.
Now for the top story tonight, freedom of speech versus dangerous conduct. In addition to the O'Donnell rhetoric, we now have public servants like Secretary of State Rice being accosted by loons. As stated, this kind of behavior is flat out dangerous and will lead to violence if not checked. This stuff is now spreading because of people like O'Donnell and the Looney website. People like Rosie O'Donnell get up there. They're seen worldwide. They say the most irresponsible stuff you can imagine. They hurt people who lost loved ones on 9/11, and then they're not held accountable by anybody but me. Every American should condemn these people, and I will tell you, I'm going to make this prediction, if they're not reined in by the authorities, and they should be, that terrible intrusion in San Francisco should have been a criminal activity there.
While O'Reilly isn't calling it homegrown terrorism, and he shouldn't either, because it absolutely is not, he is, however, calling for one of the aforementioned definitions of force to be criminalized, and he is relating it directly to free speech. It would seem to be that it is O'Reilly's position that the exercise of free speech can and will lead to violence, and that it should be criminalized. Keep in mind, Rosie was not directly expressing an opinion, but citing facts and observations in relation to an opinion. Building 7 did collapse at near free fall speed. Building 7 was not mentioned in the 9/11 Commission report. And it is a matter of public record that governments have staged events to provocate wars with other nations. Citing facts in relation to an opinion would fall under the force of logical argument, a criminalized activity according to one of the more ridiculous interpretations of the word force in relation to homegrown terrorism. The fourth possible definition of force was just as chilling. A body of persons or other resources organized or available for a certain purpose, and B, a person or group capable of influential action. Imagine defining homegrown terrorism as the use, planned use, or threatened use of influential action by a group or individual in furtherance of a political or social objective. My God, the use of influential action in furtherance of political or social objectives. Though Bill O'Reilly didn't say terrorism when he called for the criminalization of free speech, Glenn Beck went as far as to call a political campaign a domestic threat.
You know, I was thinking this morning, when you enlist in the military, you have to take an oath that says you're going to support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. On this program, we talk a lot about the foreign threats. Maybe tonight we should spend some time on the growing domestic ones. Well, here's the point tonight. While our foreign enemies are the obvious ones, the physical threat may be developing domestically as well. And here's how I got there. As I told you last week, Ron Paul raised over $4 million in one day. That's huge news. Ron Paul's supporters are tapping into something that's very real. It's something that I've talked about on this program for a very long time. The rising tide of disenfranchisement in this country. And it's coming from all sides of the political spectrum. If that feeling of disenfranchisement leads to political discussion, then our system works perfectly. But if fringe elements take that disenfranchisement and turn it into violence, we endanger the freedoms we're supposedly all fighting for.
I didn't want to believe it, but there it was. One of the most absurd definitions of force in relation to the definition of homegrown terrorism being played out on a mainstream network. On CNN, Glenn Beck calling a political campaign a domestic threat and implying that it could lead to violence. Now listen to that last bit again.
If fringe elements take that disenfranchisement and turn it into violence, we endanger the freedoms we're supposedly all fighting for.
How exactly are these freedoms being endangered? Claiming that your freedoms are being threatened by extremists is a manipulative and emotional appeal meant to distract you from the truth. And the truth is this. Your freedoms are not a physical thing that can be bombed or shot or threatened by anyone in any way. The Bill of Rights is our guarantee of freedoms preserved, and the only danger to our freedoms is that they can be legislated away, and for the moment, with your silent consent. If bills like HR1955 become law, then soon your silence may not be your consent, but your only choice. And keep in mind, once you have no voice, you can't object to anything. I do not want to consider that the authors of HR1955 actually intended these alarming definitions of force when they wrote the bill. But with these definitions being so clearly illustrated on mainstream networks, I find it alarming that 404 members of the House of Representatives would vote to pass such a bill without at least some clarification that there is not a window opening for this kind of enforcement.